forget, you see. Okay, so we're looking at the Hasidic insights on the portion of Naso, the second portion of the book of Numbers. The theme of the beginning of the book of Numbers is the census that would help the Jewish people organize and travel throughout the desert. And the premise of the Hasidic interpretation is that the concept of the desert and the concept of the traveling through the desert is actually relevant to everybody's soul, because we each figuratively travel through the desert. And when we build the temple, the figurative temple, that's the idea of refining the desert, which is the world around us, which is a spiritual desert. So that is the big idea. And then we're going to look at it specifically, and we'll also look at the specific families. Last week we read about the counting of the children of Kahat, and this week, which their job in the tent was to carry the actual furniture of the temple, the vessels, which means the ark, the menorah, the table, the altar, etc. And this week we read about the counting of the sons of Gershon, which carried the roof, which was made of curtains, and then Merari, who they were in charge of carrying the walls. So we're going to try to figure out what is the spiritual significance of all this in our soul, because again, the premise is that if it's in the Torah, then it's not just history, but it's also relevant to us. So this is, again, a talk from the Kutei Sicha, the Rebbe's collection of essays, volume 13, Naso Sicha 1. Okay, here we go. Let's read a little, we'll see how far we get. As mentioned several times, the principle that Torah is eternal applies to the entire Torah. Even matters that do not exist physically in our times continue to exist spiritually. The spiritual is the source and root of the physical. In other words, the conventional understanding is when the sages teach that the Torah is eternal, it means the commandments are eternal. Torah says put on tefillin, it means forever. Torah says keep Shabbos, it means forever. But the stories of the Torah seemingly are not eternal. The stories in the Torah are the past. There was a guy named Abraham, a woman named Sarah. The Jewish people traveled through the desert. But we're saying no. We're saying that the stories of the Torah, even the stories of the Torah, are eternal, even if they're not eternal in the physical sense. They are still eternal in the spiritual sense. This concept can be seen in the census of the Levites, beginning with the family of Kahat at the end of last week's parsha, and concluding in our parsha with the families of Gershon and Merari. Although the census is not eternal in a physical sense, for the commandment to count the Levites and the census itself took place only once in the second year of the Exodus, yet in the spiritual realm, the census is eternal, relevant in each and every generation. So that is the premise. Now we want to explain, so what is the idea of traveling through the desert, and what is the idea of the census in our own life? So we get to number 2. This will be understood by explaining first why the Jewish people had to remain in the desert for 40 years. Although it is true that the sin of the spies led to the decree delaying entry to the land of Israel by 40 years, 1 year per day, the decree only prevented them from entering the land. They had sinned not wanting to enter the land of Israel, and so they were punished by not being allowed to enter, measure for measure. Yet they could have spent those 40 years in the place of human habitation outside of Israel, rather than in the great and awesome desert in which there were snakes, vipers, and scorpions, and drought where there was no water, which is a quote from the Torah. In other words, yes, we understand that the Torah says that because the Jewish people did not want to go into Israel, so God decreed that they should not be allowed into Israel. Okay? But not going into Israel does not necessitate being in the desert, and the desert is an inhospitable place with no water. So why were they in the desert for 40 years? So here we get the Hasidic commentary by the Alter Rebbe. So the Alter Rebbe in the Kutei Torah at the beginning of this week's parsha explains that the reason they sojourned in the desert with the Mishkan, the temple, and its utensils was in order to subdue the external forces' power to receive nurture. And the source of this power is found specifically in the desert. In other words, what Rabbi Shneur Zalman is saying is that the desert represents the place where there's no human beings. It's not hospitable to humanity. In other words, this desert represents the place of unholiness. And the reason why the Jewish people travel through the desert is because they want to weaken the cosmic forces of unholiness in the world. Additionally, by subduing the external forces and the concealed concealing darkness, they were able to draw down a revelation of godliness. In order to accomplish this, the Jewish people had to sojourn in the desert for 40 years. In other words, what are we saying? The Alter Rebbe says that when the Jewish people traveled through the desert, it wasn't just to reach their destination. It wasn't just because they were not allowed into Israel, and therefore they may as well stay in the desert. No, staying in the desert represents the unholiness in the world. And when the Jewish people travel through the desert and bring the temple to that desert, number one, they're weakening the forces of unholiness in the world, and they're also bringing holy energy to the desert, which is a place of unholiness. And now the Rebbe translates what that means. In simple terms, the Jewish people's journey through the desert enables the cloud of glory to kill snakes and scorpions and made the desert habitable. Ordinarily, the desert is uninhabited in two ways. The desert is a place where man does not dwell, whereas given the presence of 600,000 Jews in the desert, man did dwell there. And B, the desert is a land not sown. Whereas the Jewish people were in the desert, the water from Miriam's well nurtured timeless varieties of vegetation and limitless varieties of vegetation and trees. So this is what we're saying. We're saying that when the Jewish people travel through the desert, there's a mystical story as well. It's not just traveling from point A to point B. What's happening is desert represents the unholiness. The Jewish people travel through the desert. They bring the temple into the desert. They're weakening the forces of unholiness and bringing holiness to the spiritual desert, to the desert which represents the spiritual desert of the world. So now what we're going to say, we too have that same responsibility, right? So our ancestors began the process of weakening the unholiness and bringing holiness to the space of unholiness. And each of us continue doing this when we travel through the figurative desert, which is our life, which is the spiritual desert, a place that is still not fully habitated by holiness and godliness. Now we're going to start thinking about, how did the Jews accomplish this? Well, they built a temple. Well, who built the temple? What was in the temple? It was the family, the Levites built the temple. And we're going to start getting into what the various families of the Levites represent. And it's not just to know about the past. More importantly, it's trying to figure out, how do we build a temple in our spiritual desert to weaken the forces of unholiness and then create a place hospitable to holiness? Okay, we continue. The journey continues, pun intended. Number 3. This idea of transforming desert into settled land. And the power to accomplish this is granted from above through the commandment to count the Levites. It is eternal as everything in the Torah and relevant in each and every generation. A person who considers his environment will sometimes conclude that he is living in a desert where the supernal man does not dwell, meaning holiness does not dwell. Because most of the people in the surroundings lack knowledge of godliness, the supernal man. Even those who are aware and heedful to conduct themselves according to Hashem's instructions in the Torah, granted there is no righteous man on earth who does good and does not sin, are nonetheless deficient in conducting themselves according to the Torah's expectations. Accordingly, a person may feel that he is in a desert where man does not dwell. For supernal man does not dwell there in a manner of settlement, permanence. In other words, even if, yes, everybody has some spaces in their life where they have holiness, but the argument is it's just temporary. It's not dwelling. Dwelling means that it's permanent. So this, we look around our life. Sometimes we don't see our life and our surroundings as a place that has permanent holiness. Even one who serves Hashem can fall into this melancholy and depression, God forbid, and abandon his mission among the impoverished of his city, leading him to flee elsewhere. In other words, sometimes a person would say, I feel my environment is not holy, not holy, so I'm just going to escape. I'm just not going to interact with anybody. For this reason, the Torah instructs us to travel through the desert and transform it. We don't have the luxury to say, well, this is a desert. I'm checking out. I'm going to a better place. No, Hashem tells us to travel through the desert. What does that mean? Similar to how the Jewish people traveled as described in our parsha. Just as they traveled through the desert according to Hashem's command, transforming it into a settled place, so to each and every Jewish person is Hashem's emissary at all times, in whatever place they find themselves, even a desolate desert. A Jew is not there by chance. God forbid, he is on a divine mission. From Hashem's man, steps are established in order to transform the environment through his divine service to a place where supernal man dwells. This is very, very powerful. Of course, it's based on the teachings of Hasidism and the Baal Shem Tov, that there's no such thing as somebody gets to a place by mistake. If I'm in a specific environment, it's because Hashem sends me as his emissary, and my job is to bring holiness there, just as the Jewish people were sent to travel through the desert. I can't say, well, it's a desert. People here are creating an environment which is not hospitable to holiness, so I'm going to just abandon the place. No, if you're here for a reason and a purpose. So that's the premise. Now we're going to continue and say a piece of Maimonides that the Rebbe always quoted, because you can argue, who built the temple in the desert? It was the Levites. Well, I'm not a Levite. I'm an Israelite. I'm not part of that tribe that was dedicated to serve God full time. So what has it got to do with me? So the answer is, Maimonides says, no, everybody can be a Levite. A Levite is a state of mind. If someone dedicates himself to the service of God, he's in the same holiness as the Levite. Maybe not technically. Maybe he doesn't get the gifts of produce that the Levites get, but spiritually, you're on the level of the Levites. And that's a piece of Maimonides, and the Rebbe always quoted that very often, because it's a very powerful thing. It means that anybody can access that level of holiness. So here we go. Rambam codifies this. Not only the tribe of Levi, but any person whose spirit generously motivates him to set himself aside and stand before Hashem to serve him, Hashem will be his portion and heritage. And Hashem will provide for him like he provided for the priests and the Levites. That's the quote from Maimonides. Each and every person whose spirit moves him to teach people God's paths and righteous judgments will be granted from above the power and prominence necessary, protecting him from being influenced by the desert. He will advance from level to level, similar to the family of Gershon, count them as well, joined with those of higher status, the family of Kahat, regarding whose count the Torah does not write as well, since their status was not subordinate to another family. By taking on this task, each person has the ability to transform his environment, even if it was originally a desert, into a dwelling place for Hashem. So in other words, that we're getting into, it's a little technical here because there were two families. The beginning of this week's parsha says, count the sons of Kahat, of Gershon also. Also means in addition to the sons of Kahat, which we counted last week, within the family of Levites, Kahat was more prominent. The bottom line is, everybody travels through the desert. Everybody has the capacity to be God's emissary to bring holiness to the environment that they are in. Okay, I think we'll go to 5. And now we get a little bit more specific and we follow the various families that are counted in last week's parsha and this week's parsha. And then we're going to see how we do this in our life. So in order for a person and his environment to become a dwelling place for Hashem, he must serve Hashem in 2 modes, right? Generally speaking, what does the service of God entail? So there's 2 general modes: turning from evil and doing good. Right? If you want to be holy, there's the aspect of doing good deeds, engaging in holiness, but there's also the aspect of separating from negativity. So turning from evil would be separating from negativity, and doing good would be the active action of connecting to holiness. The Alter Rebbe illustrates this idea by a parable of a human king. His subjects wish to build him a beautiful palace. They must first remove all the waste, and only then can beautiful furnishings be arranged. The same applies to the making of a dwelling place for Hashem. A person must turn from evil and do good. In other words, what's the metaphor? The metaphor is if you want to have a beautiful house, there's two steps. Number one is you have to clean the house. You have to get rid of the mud. But just getting rid of the mud is nice. There's no dirt, but you also have to fill the house with positive content. You want to put furniture, you want to put art, you want to put paintings, right? So that's the positive element. So you have your home, you have your environments. Step number one would be to clean it, to remove the dirt, to remove the negativity. Step number two would be to fill it with positive content. Now we're gonna go back to see how that plays out with the families that are counted last week's parsha and this week's parsha. But first, Richard, please go ahead.
Yes, I think one addition you could add to the positiveness of the home is shalom bias. When you bring, that's even more important than furniture.
Yes. So you're saying you want to bring into the home, you want to bring in a peaceful environment, peaceful atmosphere. Correct. Right. But even with a peaceful atmosphere, there's two ways of doing it, right? Let's say I want to have a peaceful atmosphere. So number one, I have to cease from raising matters that will cause tension, right? So I don't like something about you. I don't have to say it. So you left your shoes in the middle of the floor. I don't have to say it. Maybe now's not the best time to raise it. So in other words, not engaging in negative speech would be the negative, but then speaking positive words would be the positive. And you have to do both. Both are important, right? Because I could say, oh, you're such a nice guy, but you know, you're also a big shlemazel and you also make a big mess. No, if you want to create an environment, you're right. You're 100% right that we're not just talking about tangible dirt and tangible furniture. We're also talking about feelings and atmosphere. But that too, you have to be careful not to speak negatively. That would be removing the negative atmosphere. But just not say, I can come home and not say anything bad, but not say any good word, that's not going to create the environment, right? I have to hold back from talking negative, but I also have to say words, positive words that will actually bring positive energy into the space.
Right.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you for pointing that out. Yes. Okay, now we're going to look at the two families. Again, the family of the Levites of Kahat were the ones counted last week. And then this week, we have the families of Gershon and then Merari. So let's see. This is also alluded by the families of Gershon and Kahat, bearers of the Mishkan. Gershon is etymologically related to the Hebrew word gerushin, literally divorce. The word divorce in Hebrew comes to mean legaresh, is to chase away, connoting turning from evil. Gershon would mean if there's negativity trying to come into your space, you push it away. That's Gershon. So Gershon would mean pushing away the negativity. Kehat means to come close, as in the verse, and to him will be a gathering, yikat, of people, connoting doing good, as symbolized by gathering and assembly. So Gershon would mean pushing out the dirt. Kehat would mean gathering in positive furniture. Now, this is actually very interesting because the Rebbe says, it's funny, it's actually interesting. The Rebbe doesn't say, I'll first say what the Rebbe said, and maybe I'll add something. But the Rebbe says, Gershon was born before Kahat. Similarly, turning from evil must precede doing good in divine service. This order of precedence is also found in the above parable of the king. First, the waste must be removed, and only then can beautiful furnishings be arranged. So the Rebbe says here, you have two ideas. You have pushing away the negativity, stop talking negative, and then start talking positive, right? So disengage from negative habits and do positive habits. Okay, so these are the two sides, the Gershon and the Kahat. Which one comes first? So at least what the Rebbe is saying here, first, who was older? If you look at the order of birth of the sons of Levi, Gershon was older. This would imply that you first get rid of the negativity before you try to do good. And you see that from the age. So that's what the Rebbe says here. But elsewhere, the Rebbe says otherwise. Elsewhere, the Rebbe says, yes, in a perfect world, first you get rid of the mud and then you bring in the furniture. That's the logical way to do it. And that's why the Rebbe says it over here. However, the Rebbe says sometimes we don't have the strength to get rid of the negativity. You don't have the strength to pull yourself away from bad habits. And therefore, you have to start with implying, with doing good habits, with introducing good habits. And when that strengthens you, then you'll be able to get rid of the mud. So here the Rebbe just says the way it should be naturally. Naturally and logically, Gershon comes first, right? Before you work on good habits, get rid of your bad habits. But elsewhere, and the Rebbe says, where do you see that? Because that's the order of birth. Gershon is older than Kahat, because the service of Gershon, which is the service of chasing away the negativity, becomes first. I just want to say, again, the Rebbe doesn't say it here, so I'm going out on the limb, but according to what the Rebbe says elsewhere, that in the imperfect world, which is the world we inhabit, oftentimes you have to start with the positive and then worry about the negative. So it's actually interesting because in the order of the Torah, not the order of their birth, but the order of the Torah counts them, the Torah first counts Kehat. In other words, last week's Parsha, we counted the people carrying the furniture. In other words, we first count the people doing the good deeds, then we count the people who make the wall and make the roof, which is basically creating the boundary that will not let the negativity enter. So even in this Parsha, you see that there's sort of a balance. On one hand, the firstborn is the one who's getting rid of the negativity, and the one who brings in the positivity is second, but the order they're counted is the reverse. So maybe in an maybe that's consistent with what the Rebbe says elsewhere, that in an imperfect world, we don't have time and we don't have the strength to battle the negativity. So first we have to introduce positive behavior, and that gives us the strength to battle the negativity. Okay, number 6. The distinction between turning from evil and doing good can be seen in the practice, in the divine service of the families of Gershon and Kahat in transporting the Mishkan. In other words, not just in their names. So far, we just did their names. We said Gershon is divorce, is sending away, taking away. And Kahat would be gathering, and gathering would mean bringing in positive furniture or positive energy or positive deeds. But now we're going to look at the story and see what did they actually build. The family of Gershon transported the curtains of the Mishkan. Curtains is the walls. The roof. And the family of Kahat transported the utensils of the Mishkan, such as the ark and the table. The curtains surrounded and protected the entire Mishkan, whereas each utensil served a unique function. The ark of testimony, the table of showbread, etc. In other words, what is the roof and the walls doing? What they're doing is they're creating an environment, controlling what's inside, keeping out the negative forces. Whereas the family of Kahat, there, the purpose is not to keep out the environment, to keep out the negative influence, but each object itself has its own theme and its own purpose. The distinction is expressed also in a person's divine service. Turning from evil negativity protects a person from injurious prohibitions, and doing good, fulfilling mitzvot, which are testimonials, the hand which has give charity becomes a divine chariot. Through these two types of divine service, we construct the Mishkan and a perfected dwelling place for Hashem in this world. This is a talk that I've delivered on on Shabbat of Nassau, 5/7/32, 1972, exactly 40 years ago. I didn't know when I pulled this out that this is exactly 40 years ago, but it's by divine providence, exactly 40 years ago. The Rebbe would always speak based on the verse that Moshe told the Jewish people, and based on that, the Talmud says that after 40 years, you could really understand and internalize your teacher's teachings. So 40 years after the Rebbe spoke these words, now is the time where it could be internalized, fully internalized. It was able to be internalized earlier as well, but here fully internalized and made part of our life. And hopefully we'll be able to transform the desert, the spiritual desert, into a place of holiness by, number 1, creating the walls and creating the roof, which means creating a sheltered environment with the negativity. We don't let the negativity to enter. But that's not enough. Just not allowing negativity to enter is not enough. You have to fill the space and fill the environment with positive actions and positive atmosphere and positive energy. And again, that's the family of Gershon, which is to push out the negative, protect yourself from the negative environment, create a wall, right? Sometimes if there's a negative influence, you have to make a wall, you have to make a boundary. Don't let that into your space, not just your physical space, but also your mental space, right? Sometimes it's very important to say, even though we're traveling through the desert, we want to influence the desert, but the way you influence the desert is not by just saying, oh, I'm going to sleep outside in the desert and see what happens. No, you create a safe haven within the desert. And a safe haven, means borders and boundaries. And according to this Sikha, this interpretation, even though elsewhere the Rebbe says otherwise, but here we're saying, actually the first step is to create the boundary. The first step is the saying no. The first step is creating an area where there's no negative influence. Then the next step is to fill it with positive actions. So all this is, of course, very relevant, and it's general, but every person could apply it in their life, from their perspective. So thank you for joining and participating in the journey through the desert and learning how to build the tabernacle, a home for God, a permanent home from God in our desert. So thank you all for joining.
Sorry, we
Thank
were
you.
late, Rabbi.
No, all good. Well, thank you for joining.
Have a good day.